Thanks so much for making the time. We got connected because I had Dale Copeland on the podcast, and I think you were doing a takedown of some of his arguments on Twitter. And I said, hey, I want this guy on. And I reached out to you on Twitter, and you were willing to engage with me. So I appreciate you making the time to a faceless barbarian on Twitter.
My pleasure. Happy to join you.
I'm going to be a little contrarian with you. I'm by nature contrarian, but I also want to pick your brain about cybersecurity in general, because it's not every day we have an expert in that field like you on the podcast. But I wanted to talk to you about your book, World on the Brink, because I read it over the past couple of weeks, and the thing that I underlined first was you described Taiwan as sort of the Berlin of Cold War II. Of the Cold War 2.0. And I want to hack into that a little bit, because I think I disagree, but I was hoping for the listeners you could lay out why you think Taiwan is similar to what Berlin was during the Cold War.
Yeah, absolutely. It's this vital outpost that it is an incredibly dangerous place where the two great powers during the first Cold War, of course, Soviet Union and the United States, and now America and China, can actually go to war. Because in both cases, these are strategic outposts. In the first Cold War, Berlin was looked at by Kennedy and Eisenhower and Truman before him as vital for preservation of American determination, of American hold on Western Europe, preventing further expansionism by the Soviets. And President Kennedy famously in 1961 went on television in July of 1961 and basically warned the American public that we were heading towards war, because he had just come out of the summit with Khrushchev in June of that summer, and came away convinced that Khrushchev was going to try to invade West Berlin. And he warned the American public that we're going to fight for it, including potentially the risk of nuclear conflict. And that's when he asked for money from Congress to invest in setting up bomb shelters and fallout shelters across the United States, accelerated the duck and cover drills and everything else that happened during those few months. Many people sort of associate that with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened a year later. That was just 13 days of highly risky situation. This was an entire summer where America was basically going to war. Now, Taiwan is really important to U.S. interests and has always been important to U.S. interests. In 1950, General Douglas MacArthur called it the unsinkable aircraft carrier because of its strategic position in the so-called First Island chain that stretched from the Japanese islands down to Taiwan and the Philippines. And it is the anchor point of that First Island chain that allows us to contain China, because whoever dominates Taiwan really has an opportunity to dominate Asia. And right now, when China looks out at the world, it essentially sees itself completely contained by U.S. military bases and U.S. allies, right? From the east, you've got the Korean Peninsula, half of which is South Korea, has 28,000 American troops, has air bases, has radar installations, and the like. Further down, you have the Japanese islands, the headquarters of the 7th Fleet, Marines on Okinawa, enormous military capabilities we have. Then, right at the center, right in the middle of the Taiwan Strait, facing China, you've got the island of Taiwan and the outlying islands viewed as an outpost, essentially, of America by the Chinese. And then further down, you have the Philippines, where for the first time in 30 years, our military is back and getting access to the Taiwanese military bases like we had until 1992 when we left. So for China to be able to become the world's greatest power, which they clearly not just want to be, but also think it's their rightful place to be, because for much of human history, they were the world's greatest power, the world's richest power, and only at the advent of the Industrial Revolution did they start losing that place, first to the Europeans and then to Americans. So they believe that they're just reemerging to their rightful place, being the greatest power in the world. Well, you can't let another power, America, continue that way, and particularly constrain your naval power, which is really the cornerstone of power projection. And right now, for the Chinese Navy, whether it's the surface ships or the submarines, to be able to get through the First Island chain, you have to get through the choke points that are controlled by the U.S. Navy. By taking Taiwan, by putting military bases, naval bases, submarine bases on the other side of Taiwan, the eastern part of Taiwan, they can essentially project power across the Western Pacific, make it very, very dangerous for the U.S. Navy to operate, effectively kick us out of that region and dominate it. Now, I don't believe that China is sort of the new Nazi Germany that's going to start invading Japan or Philippines or any of these other places, as some people do. I think that's very hard to pull off. In 1945, it would have been very difficult for us to invade Japan. I don't think anyone, China or anyone else, is invading Japan anytime soon. But you don't need to invade countries to bully them around and to dominate the region. After all you have to do is look at Russia and what it can do in Central Asia or in the Caucasus, where it has a sphere of influence and basically is able to bully these countries around without invading them and making sure that they're doing the Russian bidding, because they have no choice, right? They're living next to a more powerful neighbor. The U.S. is far away and can't do anything for them, and thus when Russia says to jump, they basically have to say how high. And that will happen to Japan, that will happen to Korea, that will happen to the Philippines. In that region, if China is able to dominate it, and taking Taiwan is critical to that.
There's a lot to unpack there, and several things that I disagree with. But I want to start with this, which is, you make this analogy to Taiwan as the Berlin of this new Cold War. But it seems to me that, and you've already sort of referenced the guy who is at the center of the analogy that I would use, which is Douglas MacArthur. And it seems to me that what we're really talking about here is a second Korean war, quote unquote, or a second U.S.-China war. And I say that because it seems to me that most U.S. strategic decision makers after World War II, after the communists win the Civil War in China, decide that Taiwan is not an existential security interest for the United States. Also decide that South Korea is not an existential security interest for the United States. Dean Acheson famously leaving South Korea out of the security umbrella when he's speaking at the press club, and the Soviets encouraging the North Koreans to go after South Korea as a result. And then you have MacArthur, who wants to push past the Yalu, who once Truman changes his mind at the last minute because he's worried about domestic politics in the United States and how he looks bad from a China perspective, and also some concerns about containment. He does a complete 360. He says, no, we're going to defend South Korea. We're going to sail aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Strait. We're going to make sure that, deter Mao so that he doesn't go after these things. And then MacArthur pushes all the way up to the Chinese border, and then the Chinese come back, and we get 3 years and 1 million plus dead in Korea, and the line doesn't really move at all. It's a pointless war. Nothing moves, and we're stuck with the current situation on the Korean Peninsula in terms of today. And I guess where I want to go at you is a little bit is I don't see how Taiwan is an existential interest to the United States. And if your goal is to contain China, you can contain China just fine from the Philippines and from Japan. And if you bat some eyelashes to the countries around the Strait of Malacca, like, the game is actually there. So why am I wrong? Why am I being too short-sighted in thinking that Taiwan is not this sort of be-all, end-all for U.S. from a national security point of view in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, you're wrong, because it's all about sea-based lines of communication, and our ability to resupply forces in Japan, in the Philippines, basically go away if China is able to control Taiwan, if it's going to be able to project power from the eastern shores of Taiwan, which are very, very deep. Right now, the depth of the waters all along the Chinese coast, both in South China Sea and East China Sea, is very, very shallow. In the Taiwan Straits, the depth of the waters is about 300 feet. It's too shallow to even put a submarine in. On the other side of Taiwan, it goes down to 12,000 feet and goes much further the further you go down into the Pacific. The Pacific, of course, is the world's deepest ocean. So being able to have the submarines of the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy, the surface ships, of course, they now have 2 aircraft carriers and a third one about to be commissioned probably in the next year, is going to have a dramatic impact on the U.S. ability, of the U.S. Navy's ability to operate in that region without fear of being sunk and without fear of being impacted both by the rocket forces and the aircraft carrier killer missiles that the Chinese have developed, but also by the ability of their surface and underwater navy to project power in that region. So you can have bases on the Philippines, but how are you going to resupply them when the Chinese are controlling that navy, as they have now done in South China Sea? It is very, very difficult for the U.S. to now operate in South China Sea, given the radar installations that they've put in there on those artificial islands, and given the presence of the Chinese Navy. Yes, we do freedom of navigation exercises to kind of challenge it every once in a while, but if you talk to U.S. Navy commanders, if there's any sort of risk of confrontation with China, we're getting the heck out of the South China Sea because our presence there is not sustainable and is at huge risk. And that will happen in that region. That is the most vital region of the world, right? You have almost 50% of the world's GDP there. You have most of the supply chains, much of the economic growth. To allow China to dominate that region is going to be incredibly detrimental to the national security and economic security of the United States.
Yeah, I guess I struggle with the metaphor because, I mean, Germany is the beating heart of Europe, and you're on the northern European plain there when you're talking about Berlin. So you can drive a tank basically from Moscow to the beaches of Normandy and not really meet anything. So if you're going to lose Germany in that sense, like the domino effect feels sort of real. Whereas if Taiwan, like it's hard for me to sort of compare the northern European plain to the South China Sea because the problems of power projection for the Chinese Navy get all the more complicated in trying to push out from there. Like it's not like they're going to be able to conquer the Philippines just because they have that base at Taiwan. So I don't know.
Well, it's not about conquering it. It's about dominating that region with naval power and kicking the U.S. out. And look, this is not a hypothetical. I've had senior officials in the governments in that region tell me that if China takes Taiwan, regardless of how it does it, whether it's because the U.S. chooses not to fight or it fights and loses and Taiwan ultimately becomes controlled by China, that will change their security posture. They will now treat it as China dominating that region, being the new sheriff in town, the U.S. being far away as Hawaii, effectively. And it's not that they're going to abandon their security relationships with us or suddenly get in Chinese orbit completely, but they're going to have to accommodate them. And they're going to have to appease them in many ways because they will now have a new sheriff in town.
And you don't think they're going to be that sheriff anyway, by virtue just of the economic center of gravity that China's pulling right there?
No, because their economy is already in stagnation, effectively. Their real growth is about 2.5%, 3% right now, about the same as ours. Their economy is 25% less. Their Made in China 2025, that is almost certainly not going to be met, plan is all about indigenous production, independence. So they're kicking out Western firms, including Japanese firms, by the way, out of their country. So the attractiveness of China and investments in China is diminishing by the day. Of course, on top of that, you have all of the Xi's policies in terms of crackdown on the tech sector, crackdown on foreign investors, or arresting Western businesses and the like. So the interest of companies really across the world in coming to China and continuing to invest in China is at the lowest point you've seen in the last 20, 30 years. And by the way, one more point I want to make, that if you look at the rise of American power, how did America become the superpower it is today? It didn't start after World War II, right? We were already a great power long before that. And it really tracks to the early days of the 20th century when you've seen an enormous rise of the American Navy. And the probably seminal moment of that period was the Great White Fleet that Teddy Roosevelt sent around the world to basically announce that America has arrived, that circumvented the globe and went all the way from Japan to the Panama Canal and so forth. And that was an indication to everyone else that America is now a seafaring nation that is able to secure the world's trade routes around the world and can go basically anywhere. And that, if you look at the course of the 20th century, that was essential to our ability to increase our trading partners across the world, both before and certainly after World War II, to be able to build our prosperity in this country. And if you lose that to China, at least in Asia, at least initially in Asia, you're going to have a decline of American economic dominance and our ability to set the terms of trade and security order in one of the most important regions of the world.
Would you suggest then that the United States should recognize Taiwan as an independent country?
No, I don't think you need to do that, because what we want ultimately is the status quo. Right? It is China that is a revisionist power that wants to change the status quo. What we want is Taiwan not to declare independence, to be this de facto state that is not recognized by us, but that the peace and prosperity in the Taiwan Strait is preserved, and that China is contained by our friends and allies in that particular region. And if we're able to do that, I believe we can win the 21st century because ultimately I believe China is a declining power and America has enormous strengths, whether it's our innovation base, whether it's our ability to attract the world's best and brightest people to come here and immigrate to this country, as I was able to do with my family in the 1990s, whether it's our access to capital, whether it's our technological base, whether it's our military, whether it's our alliance networks, all of these advantages that we've got that China doesn't have. And its demographics are terrible, right? They're going to go from 1.4 billion people that they have today to, conservatively speaking, about 550 million by the end of the century. An incredible demographic collapse that we've never seen in world history happen in one country. And on top of that, you've got huge economic mismanagement, an enormous real estate bubble, and so forth. So all we have to do is wait them out and make sure that they don't present a threat to us by dominating Asia. So this is a strategy of patience. This is a strategy of biding our time and making sure that our economy remains the world's greatest economy that will enable us, of course, to invest more in our military strength as well.
I come much more around to your viewpoint on the United States, and we can get to that a little bit later. And I especially would love for you to tell the listeners a little bit more of your story, and also because you and I have not exactly the same stories, but similar stories, and how we came to this country and why we might have a more optimistic view than the mainstream media wants to sell us. But I want to get to this thing about biding time and about outweighting China, because it seems to me that this is exactly what China wants. And here I won't throw the Korean War analogy at you. I would throw the Hong Kong analogy at you, which is China spends decades building infrastructure around Hong Kong, isolating Hong Kong, all these other things, so that when Margaret Thatcher shows up in the 1980s and wants to renew the lease, Deng Xiaoping says, okay, but we're going to cut off the water and we're going to cut off the electricity and you're going to have to do all this stuff yourself. So do you really want that Hong Kong? And she has to give it up, even as she's sort of at the height of British nationalism. And it seems to me that China wants to wait us out. Like, China's view of the United States is that the United States is a late capitalist declining power, and that China is willing to stick around for as long as it actually takes to get to that Hong Kong type scenario where they take Taiwan without ever having to fire a shot. And this to me is maybe the weakness in what you're talking about, because if the United States is not willing to recognize Taiwan as an independent country, but it is still going to rely on Taiwan to build enough of a national identity to defend itself, or at least to have enough of a defensive capability to deter a Chinese intervention, you need the poll numbers in Taiwan or the sort of engagement with the military in Taiwan to reinforce that. And that's not what the polls say. The polls say in Taiwan that they want the status quo, and that a relatively small percentage of the population, I think the latest reading for 2023 was 21.5%. It was as low as, 15% in 2018. It sort of goes up and down depending on what's in the news, of Taiwanese people actually want independance at all, that you have a significant chunk that want reunification, and that more than anything,
so that's not true. So that's not true. So you have to look at exactly what the polls are saying. And right now, when asked directly, do you want to unify with China? The answer to that is that about 7% of the Taiwanese public, 7%, is for unification with China at any point. About 1% want it right away, and the other 6% at some point in the future. And by the way, out of those 7%, which is basically nothing, it's not clear how many of them see unification as the longtime supporters of the KMT, the Chinese nationalists, have always seen it, which is that we're going to unify by taking over the mainland, right? But at any rate, 7% is basically a tiny minority that can, for all intents and purposes, be ignored. But having spent time in Taiwan, I can tell you that there's virtually no constituency in Taiwan that is interested in unification with China. And those numbers have been going down for the last 30 years as Taiwan transitioned to democracy, because they've developed a very, very strong sense of their own identity, their own history, their own culture. By the way, as I write in the book, Taiwan never actually fully belonged to China. This is one of those myths that's been perpetrated by the CCP. There's never been one moment in history when whoever fully controlled China also fully controlled Taiwan, not one. And in fact, I cite this remarkable episode in the book where in the 1860s, a U.S. merchant marine ship crashes on Taiwan. The landing party disembarks and gets slaughtered by the native tribesmen, who, by the way, are not Han Chinese. Their indigenous population is Austronesians. And Washington launches a formal complaint to the Chinese emperor because ostensibly the Chinese empire controls Taiwan. And the response they get is basically, we don't control those people. They're wild tribesmen. You're welcome to do whatever you want with them, right? They never had that full control of the island. And not only do we experience that, but the Japanese have experienced the same issues when they've had expeditionary forces land on Taiwan and get encounters with a population that were very hostile. And that's what actually triggered the Japanese in the 1890s to finally fully conquer the island, the first time that anyone's been able to actually colonize this place, despite numerous attempts by the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch and others. The Japanese are the ones that actually established that full control. Of course, after World War II in 1945, it is given to Chiang Kai-shek. But at that point, Chiang Kai-shek is not fully in control of China, is increasingly losing China to Mao in the civil war that he has been fighting, and then ultimately flees to Taiwan. The strong sense of their own history that is separate from China has developed really remarkably since the fall of the dictatorial regime in the 1990s in Taiwan. And I can tell you, I'm fully convinced that if China was the sort of beacon of freedom and democracy in the world, that the Taiwanese would want nothing to do with it. Just like Canada doesn't have any interest in joining the United States as the 51st state, right? They have their own country. They're very proud of it, their own history, their own culture. That's what's happening in Taiwan now. Now, you're right that the people that, if you ask them the question, do you support independence? A strong plurality typically will say no. And in fact, that is the official position even of the so-called pro-independence party that is now controlling the presidency, the DPP, because their position is we don't need to declare independence. We're already an independent nation, right? Countries don't just willy-nilly declare independence if they're independent. And of course, the population in Taiwan appreciates that the Declaration of Independence is very provocative, that the United States would be opposed to it, that it can trigger a conflict with China. So that is why you get the answer that you get to the Independence Declaration. But it does not mean that almost anyone in Taiwan is for unification with China.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I misspoke. I wasn't trying to say that there is a large faction within Taiwan that wants to rejoin China, although I would push back at you with the idea that 7% doesn't matter. That's a large enough figure that I think it does matter, especially if we talk about 6% non-respondents, blah, blah, blah. But I'm not here to make the case that any significant faction wants to rejoin Taiwan. I am just making the case that if you are China and you're looking at the board, I think the way that you're interpreting it is, okay, they have this sense of national identity. Yes, Taiwan has sort of always been this backwater where rebels against the emperor go to run away from the Chinese army when it comes to hunt them down and things like that. But at the end of the day, this is Chinese language. This is Chinese culture, and the West is making the same mistake that it made with China, that it thinks just because they have semiconductors and iPhones and economic freedom that this place is going to become more liberalized and more democratized and more like the West, whereas really Taiwan is much closer to China when it comes to culture and things like that than it is going to be towards anything in the West. And if China can sort of slowly chip away at the edges, make sure that no country recognizes Taiwan as an independent country, steal all the semiconductor engineers so that, Taiwan's semiconductor advantage isn't there, steal whatever brain power is there by offering them penthouses in Shanghai and everything else, make Taiwan even more and more and more dependent on the Chinese economy over time, that a time will come 20, 30 years from now where the majority of Taiwanese still want the status quo and where the United States on a relative power basis is not where it is today, which today the U.S. can effectively deter, I think, China in terms of its military capability. I'm not convinced 20, 30 years from now, if China keeps modernizing at the pace that it is, that the United States is going to be able to do that. So how would you respond to that scenario?
Yeah, I just don't think that's the reality. The longer China waits, the worse it gets for them, because the reality is the balance of power has shifted in the last 20 years, not because China's modernized, although that is certainly a component of it, but because we largely dropped our eye on the ball, because we were distracted with fights in the Middle East, with the war on terror. The Taiwanese stopped investing in their defenses largely in the 2000s and early 2010s. And the Japanese, of course, have not paid much attention to their security forces. That is all changing dramatically now, right? Everyone in the region is increasing their defense spending. The Taiwanese are, the Japanese are. They're actually, changing their security laws in response to the threat of China. The Philippines, right, inviting us back in, increasing their defense spending as well. So when you actually look at what's going to happen in the 2030s and 2040s, a lot of those capabilities, a lot of those investments that we're making and everyone else in the region are making, AUKUS, for example, with Australia and the UK, those are going to come online late 2030s, early 2040s. So that's going to make it very, very difficult for China to actually orchestrate this invasion, because this island is truly a natural fortress. Invading this place, I can't think of a worse places in the world to try to invade. First of all, the Taiwan Strait is very treacherous. Half the year, it's basically impassable to anything but huge container ships. You've got fog, you've got typhoons, huge swells taking place in the Taiwan Strait. And then the island itself, the terrain is just horrendous. You've got mountains, you've got rivers, bridges, tunnels, a lot of very natural impediments to an invading force. So if you have a capable military defending it, this island is all but impregnable to invasion. And in fact, that's exactly what it was like in 1945 when the Japanese were entrenched on it, and we decided to bypass it because of the difficulty of dislodging the Japanese from that island and ultimately invaded Okinawa. But a lot of those capabilities are going to be there in 10, 15 years. So the longer that the Chinese wait, the worse it gets for them. Probably in 4 years or so, they're going to be at the peak of their ability to actually orchestrate this invasion before most of those investments come online. So if they're going to do it, I believe that that is the optimal window to do it, and then it may close the longer they wait. The other thing that's, I think, is driving this timeline is Xi Jinping. Just like Putin, this guy is impatient. This guy is all about his own ego. He wants to go down into the pantheon of Chinese history as a great leader, as someone who is greater than Mao and can accomplish the one thing that Mao could never do, which is take Taiwan. And, you know, he is open about this, right? He talks about how this problem of Taiwan, quote unquote, can be passed to the next generation. Well, he is in his 70s, right? In 2032, he's going to be 79 when his potentially last term in power ends, assuming he gets reelected by a Chinese Communist Party Congress in 27. And in the Chinese system, unlike ours, they don't tend to elect their leaders into their 80s. So both looking at his potential of staying in power as well as his own longevity and mortality, he, I think, is going to be looking at that window of 2028 past his reelection through 2032 to actually get this done and get that notch on his belt that he is the one that did this. I think the similarities with Putin are remarkable, because Putin could have said the same thing that you're saying, that eventually, you know, the West is going to get tired of supporting Ukraine, all this corruption that's taking place there. If I can just wait them out, I can use bribery, I can use coercion like I have in the past to try to get the Ukrainians to turn against me. But he was impatient. He said, no, I'm going to try to do this because I want to do this on my own watch. I'm the new Peter the Great. I'm going to expand the Russian Empire. And I think the same dynamic is playing out in China.
I'm glad you made this. First of all, I appreciate the shots fired at the octogenarians running the United States. Perfect. Second of all, I'm glad you took us to Xi, because that was sort of the next topic that I wanted to go at. And here again, I have a little bit of a different view of him, although I admit, I don't know if you've seen this New Yorker article from 2015 that's about his daughter and how she came to Harvard sort of under a pseudonym. And there's like a picture of him like laughing while he's biking his daughter around in the streets when she's a kid. And I also have a young daughter, and I've been biking my daughter around the street. So I'm like, come on, how bad could this guy be? He's biking his daughter around. I don't remember Putin even claiming his children, let alone sending out pictures of them biking.
No, he's got two daughters too. Well, two daughters he's acknowledged, and I think a number of others.
Yeah, but I think he spends his time with pictures with his shirt off in the cold fighting bears, not family man biking his kids around. But anyway, the question I wanted to ask you was, you're obviously more pessimistic on China than I am, but one of the things you talk about in the book is about how there's sort of this perfect storm right now under Xi, where you've got his quote-unquote economically destructive policies like zero COVID, tech industry crackdowns, and then you combine that with the wolf warrior diplomacy, and China's really just driving its foreign policy off a cliff. And one of the things I wanted to ask you was, well, he turned back on zero COVID, the tech industry came to heel, he's put the wolf warriors to the side for now. Maybe he'll drag them out again, but it seems like he didn't like the wolf warrior stuff and that it went too far too fast. It seems to me that unlike Putin, he's at least showing some capacity for changing his mind or doing things differently. Do you buy that at all, or do you think I'm looking through rose-tinted glasses?
At the margins at best, because he has not changed, of course, the hardcore nature of the regime, which is it's first and foremost focused on security, not economics. All of his policies, despite the charm offensive that he started last year to try to attract businesses back in China, have not changed, right? Your ability to do due diligence in China is basically non-existent because of the security laws he's passed that makes it basically illegal to get access to certain information. Most of the law firms, Western law firms, have left the country. Well, if you've run a business, you know that you can't really operate in another country without access to Western lawyers to keep you on the straight and narrow. If you don't have that, you're not coming back. The reality is that the Wolf Warrior stuff has been slightly diminished, but is not gone away. And I'll tell you a quick story. In February of this year, I was at the Munich Security Conference, which I attend every year. I've been going there about a dozen years. And I was in a session on supply chains where you had Chinese representative, Indian representative, Japanese, Australians, US. And it was a fairly kind of low-key session. It wasn't supposed to be this geopolitical confrontation in any sense. It was to talk about resilience of supply chains and how we can all work together. And it started with this Indian government representative, basically saying that India is open for business. Apple has been the iPhones there. They're welcoming more investments and so forth. And then the Chinese representative gets on the microphone and first of all turns to the Indian representative and says, these Western countries that are here, they're trying to divide us into good students and bad students, and we shouldn't let them. We should work together. And then, to my shock and the shock of everyone in the room, without skipping a beat, turns to the rest of the audience and says, by the way, no one should be going to India. We've got all the supply chains. We've got all the workers. India's not going to help you at all. Come to China. You can't decouple from China. We are here, and India is not going to be of any benefit to you. I mean, just absolutely shocking way of trampling on a country that had no interest really in confronting you, right, at least in that setting, and stepping all over them. And the Indian representative had an amazing response. He said, we may be students, but we don't need a master teacher. So the ability of the Chinese to just piss everyone off, even those that are not necessarily against them to begin with, is just absolutely remarkable. A year prior at the Munich Security Conference, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, was being interviewed by the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, Wolfgang Ischinger, and Ischinger threw him a complete softball. He said, we're here in Germany. We're very concerned about this war in Ukraine that's been going on. The last thing the world needs right now is another crisis. Can you just reassure the people attending the Munich Security Conference that you're not planning to invade Taiwan anytime soon? And cause another global crisis. And Wang Yi, instead of taking the softball, says the one thing I want to do is reassure everyone in this room that Taiwan belongs to China. So, these people just can't help themselves, in part because I think, and this is where I agree with you, they don't think that they're declining power. They think the U.S. is declining power. I think they're very wrong on that, but they just are so self-confident, and I think that plays to our advantage. So to the extent that we can make them wait, that's better for us because I think they've got all the problems and we are very strong.
Before we leave Xi and turn to the United States, you talked about him thinking of himself as greater than Mao. And this was the other thing I wanted to ask you about him, because his family suffered very much under Mao's regime. And I think he has ingrained in his brain that he wants to be different than Mao. If I was a betting man, I would bet that Xi would hope that his career is remembered more like Deng Xiaoping's at the end of the day than Mao's, because Mao, he did certain things for China, but he also sort of couldn't control what he created, and he needed constant chaos. Whereas Deng was able to create something that for 30 years or so created an immense amount of prosperity and wealth for the Chinese people, sort of something that hadn't been seen for hundreds of years. So do you think there is any part of Xi's experience of Maoism that makes him potentially better, that makes him able to navigate some of these things? Is it just impossible? We're talking about an individual crashing against, huge societal forces that he can't deal with. Do you think that that's just lip service and that really is underneath it all? There's a red-bearing Maoist underneath it. Like, how do you think about him in that perspective?
Yeah, I think Mao was much more of an adventurous and a gambler than Xi is. I think Xi makes wrong decisions, but I think he's more cautious than Mao ever was. So I don't see, Xi launching a cultural revolution or doing anything that crazy. But fundamentally, I don't think that he's like Deng, that prioritized the economy over security. In fact, everything you've seen from Xi suggests the opposite, that if you look at the Politburo, he's pushed everyone out that knows anything about managing economics, managing growth. He's filled it with loyalists that understand security, understand population control, social control. That is what he's focused on. And even right now, when the country is facing a severe economic crisis and stagnation, is he authorizing huge bailouts? Is he investing in the economy at the level that most people think he should be doing in order to reinvigorate growth? No. In fact, he's saying, I'm not really a believer in that type of socialism and welfare, ironically, for Marxist-Leninists. And I think that we should focus on making our country stronger in the military sense and in the population control sense than in the economic sphere. So while Deng was liberalizing the economy, Xi is doing the exact opposite.
Yeah, although I think his ideological flexibility on resisting the credit bazooka actually is a good thing, but I hear you. Let's move to the United States a little bit. The first thing I wanted to ask you was, what do you think of U.S. policy today? Because in the book, you make a fairly nuanced argument for sort of selective decoupling or for more integration with China to keep them dependent on the United States, increase leverage, don't just, isolate them with tariffs and things like that. So my expectation is that you would think that Biden's policies with China are not great because they don't increase that integration, and that Trump's are even worse because they just, the 60% tariff on all Chinese imports things is like a great wall against any integration in the first place. So am I right about that? Or do you see things in either Biden or candidate Trump's foreign policy that you like towards China that keeps with some of the recommendations you would make?
So I would say at a high level, both Trump and Biden have a very similar view of China, which is that China is a threat and that we need to address it. So that I very much agree with. I think on the details, I have disagreements with both men. And in some ways, I believe they haven't gone far enough. In other ways, I think they've done some things that are counterproductive. But you're right. I'm not advocating for full decoupling for two reasons, really. A, it's impossible, right? China's economy is too big. And even if we decouple, the rest of the world is not going to do it. So we're just going to harm ourselves. And two, when you decouple, you actually decrease your leverage over them, which is not what we want to do because we want to have maximum leverage in order to try to deter their attempt to conquer Taiwan. So what I argue and what I coin in the book is this phrase unidirectional entanglement, essentially creating this asymmetry where we make China more dependent on us and us less dependent on China. And particularly to do that in four critical areas. Look, I don't care if we keep buying sneakers and apparel from China. I don't care if they're manufacturing our paper or other goods that we can source from elsewhere if we had to, but are not vital to our national security, are not vital to our economic prosperity. Do you know what the number one import, by the way, from China is to the United States by value? It is toys, right? I have no problem with buying as many toys as we need to from China. Now, I'd like for them to be better quality and not have lead in them so that they're poisoning our kids. So the standards need to be higher. But nevertheless, if we have a great dependence on toys from China, it's not the end of the world. What I don't want to see is to have dependence on China in four critical technology areas that I believe will determine economic prosperity in the century. They are AI and autonomy, biotech and synthetic biology, aerospace, space technologies, and green energy. Now, the good news is in the first three, we're leading China and we have very few dependencies on them. And in fact, they have more dependencies on us in those critical technology areas. On the fourth one, on green energy, we are completely losing to China, right? Whether it's EVs, batteries, wind, solar, nuclear, they're just leading in every single way, in part because they've engaged in so much subsidization of that sector, overcapacity, stealing intellectual property by the truckloads. But nevertheless, we are where we are. And then in addition to those four technologies, you have two critical components that are enabling them. And those are chips and critical minerals. On critical minerals, the situation is quite bad as well because even though mining for critical minerals both rare earths and lithium, cobalt, nickel, all these elements, is happening in lots of places, including here domestically in the United States. Processing and refining largely happens in China because, again, they've over-subsidized that industry and engaged in dumping on the rest of the world to drive everyone else out of business. We need to auto-correct that, and we need tariffs for that. And the Biden administration has just announced tariffs on critical minerals that will go into effect next year, which are really, really important. The second one is the semiconductor industry, and there, I think we've done some good things, but we have not gone far enough. So one of the things we've done is we've limited the ability to, for the equipment manufacturers of the semiconductor manufacturing equipment to export to China. So basically, if you make equipment that is used exclusively to produce chips below 18 nanometers, you cannot export to China. And not only have we done that, but we've convinced the Dutch and the Japanese, that are the other big manufacturers of this equipment, to do the same. That was very helpful, but it doesn't go far enough, because what that has done is largely curtailed the Chinese ability to produce advanced chips. That is fantastic for applications like AI, iPhones, Xboxes, and the like. It is not enough if you're talking about chips that are being produced for weapon systems, for your cars, for your televisions, for pretty much any use case out there, radar installations and the like. And these are the so-called foundational chips, basically 20 nanometers and above, that we've said, you know what, those are commodity chips. We don't care if they're being manufactured in China. But the problem with that thinking is that these are really, really foundational chips, and you can't actually build anything without those chips. So even if you look at your iPhone, that iPhone has about 150, 160 chips, depending on the version. Only 3 of those chips are advanced: your processor, your memory, and your baseband modem that connects to your cell tower. Every other chip that controls your battery, your power management, your Wi-Fi, your GPS, your accelerometer, your screen, your camera, all of those chips are foundational. Without those chips, you don't have a phone. So in effect, saying we're going to control the manufacturing of advanced chips in the West, in Taiwan and Japan and the US, and we're going to prevent China from dominating that region, but letting them dominate the foundational chips is akin to saying, we're going to make sure that China never is able to manufacture carbon fiber, this new advanced material that's lightweight that we can use to manufacture things like the Boeing Dreamliner. It's phenomenal, but we don't care if China completely corners the market on steel aluminum. Well, guess what? You can't build anything without steel aluminum, right? Even that Boeing Dreamliner, 20-30% of that is based out of steel aluminum. So those are the foundational chips. So I argue that we need to go much further, and we need to prevent China from building any chips in their country, because again, they're completely relying on the Western supply chain for equipment, for precursor chemicals, masks, photoresist, all those things that you need to operate a fab is coming from the West. It's coming from us. It's coming from Japan. It's coming from the Netherlands and a few other places. And if we manage to stop the export of that technology to China, we dramatically curtail their ability to produce chips. It's not going to be forever. At some point, they're going to figure it out, but it will take them 10 plus years to do so. And while we're buying that time, we can actually invest in defensive capabilities in Taiwan, in Philippines, in Japan, and Guam, and elsewhere, where we can make this invasion much less likely. So I think that in some areas we have to go much further. In other areas, I don't care about instituting tariffs on their toys and apparel items and the like. I don't think it's particularly helpful.
Yeah, and you really are underscoring how important it is to get the macro directional question right, which is China rising? Is China falling? Is the United States rising? Is the United States weakening relative? Like that's it's a whole different set of recommendations if you have a different view of the macro, which is a nice way to get to the last question I wanted to ask you, which is, what do you think about the United States today and its strengths? I noticed in the chapter where you were talking about, ideas and influences as some of the things that really help the United States, and talking about the malleability and flexibility of U.S. political power over time. You have a nice little vignette in there about Hamilton and Hamilton getting shot in the duel, and how that was, sort of a rarity in U.S. political history. But the Civil War wasn't in there. And there is history in the United States of our flexible political system not figuring it out and leading to sort of cataclysm. I don't think that that's the most likely scenario by any means. I think we're headed more towards an FDR or a Reagan type moment. But talk to me about sort of how you're feeling about the United States right now, because I think for many, at least American listeners, it is difficult to be optimistic about the country at this particular moment.
Look, as I mentioned, we have so much strengths. We've got the innovation, we've got the investment, we've got the global influence through our alliance networks, we've got the ideas, we've got immigration, albeit, not the most optimal. I'm not in favor for, open borders and just anyone being able to come in. I wish we would cherry pick the best and the brightest around the world and let them come here, like I was able to do. But nevertheless, the fact that we have thousands of people every single day trying to come across our border, again, not a great thing in terms of our security and uncontrolled immigration, but it's an indication that we are still the place that attracts everyone around the world, right? No one is trying to jump the fence across China and get into China these days, right? They want to come here. In fact, thousands of Chinese are coming across our border every single day, which tells you something. Now, a number of them, I'm sure, are intelligence operatives that are trying to infiltrate this country, but I think many of them are also people that are trying to look for a better life for themselves as the Chinese economy is stagnating and unemployment is skyrocketing. So I think we have enormous advantages. The big unanswered question, of course, in the book is, are we actually going to be able to use those advantages, or are we going to squander them because we don't have the political will and we're so divided? But, we've always been divided. You mentioned the Civil War. I mean, you look at the foundation of this country, the Revolutionary War. There were loyalists and patriots on both sides of families. Like Benjamin Franklin's son was a hardcore loyalist. Right during the Vietnam War, we're incredibly divided. The Civil Rights Movement. I mean, you can go on and on. We've gone through these phases where we fought with each other, including viciously. Civil War was the number one war in terms of casualties that the United States has ever fought. But nevertheless, when we face with an external threat, we tend to come together and we tend to mobilize our resources to address that issue. And I believe we're facing one right now with China. And it's not an accident that Joe Biden and Donald Trump, the two people that have the least amount of things in common with each other than perhaps anyone on the planet, agree on one thing, and that is that China is a threat. They have some disagreements on tactical details of how to confront it, but essentially Biden continued most of the trade policy and the overall China policy that Trump brought into office, right? So that is remarkable. And the fact that I live in Washington, D.C., down here in Capitol Hill, both sides of the aisle can't find anything to agree on except China. So that gives me hope that, we can find a way forward and we can use those incredible strengths that we have to ultimately address this threat. What I worry about is time, that we're running out of time. As I write in the book, this invasion, I think, can happen as soon as 4 years from now. That's not a lot of time. It's a little bit of time, but it's not a lot of time to wait and sit around and do nothing. We don't have a moment to waste. So I hope that we can get our strengths, pull them together and actually address this threat, because what we really need to do is deter this threat of invasion, right? I'm not a proponent of war. I hope we never fight a war with China, because that will be a disaster for the world economy, for, of course, loss of life here. On a level that we perhaps haven't seen on a daily basis since World War II, maybe even World War I. So we need to avoid it at all costs. We need to preserve the status quo that has existed across the Taiwan Strait for the last 45 years. And if we do that, I think the century will remain an American century. I hope we can accomplish that.
Dmitri, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to talk to you and engage. And I hope you'll agree to come on at minimum in 2027, when we can talk about how China didn't invade Taiwan, and we can debate whether it was effective American deterrence or whether they never planned to all along. Is there any place?
But, this is my first book, and I hope to write a book in 2032 of how we got it right and how we avoided the World War III scenario. So 2032, I think, is that time frame for when she is likely to lose power, and perhaps we don't know who's going to come after, but perhaps things could get better.
Well, hopefully by then this podcast will be bigger than the Joe Rogan podcast, and you'll come back on and we'll beam it out to everybody who's listening. So I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.